My parents refused to care for my twins while I was in emergency surgery, saying that I was a nuisance and a burden since they had tickets to see Elton John with my sister. So, I called a nanny from the hospital bed, cut all family ties, and ended my financial support to them. 2 weeks later, they showed up at my front door. My mother yelled that I should never ask them to cancel their plans again, her voice echoing through my hospital room. I sat there stunned, clutching my phone with trembling hands. It was Christmas Eve at the Las Vegas Medical Center. Let me take you back to how this entire nightmare began. The pain started as a dull ache right behind my ribs early that morning. By the time the afternoon sun started setting, casting long, dark shadows across my living room floor, that dull ache had turned into a blinding, searing agony. It felt exactly like someone was twisting a jagged, rusty knife deep inside my abdomen. I remember falling to my knees right there on the carpet, clutching my stomach while my 2-year-old twins, Vernon and Maxine, stopped playing with their building blocks and stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. I knew something was horribly wrong. I managed to drag myself to the kitchen counter, grab my car keys, and somehow wrestle both toddlers into their heavy winter coats and their car seats. The drive to the Las Vegas Medical Center was a complete blur of bright streetlights and festive holiday decorations that seemed to mock the absolute terror rising in my throat. When I finally stumbled through the sliding glass doors of the emergency room, the triage nurse took one look at my pale, sweating face and immediately called for a wheelchair. Within an hour, the diagnosis was delivered by a grim-faced doctor. They had found severe internal bleeding related to complications from a previous medical issue. It required immediate, emergency surgery. The doctor looked me directly in the eyes and said that if they did not operate right now, I might not survive the night. So there I was, in a sterile, brightly lit hospital room. It was just me, Vernon, and Maxine. The twins were sitting on a thin, uncomfortable vinyl chair in the corner of the room, playing quietly with a plastic red fire truck and a small stuffed duck I had managed to grab on our way out of the apartment. A kind, soft-spoken nurse named Francine was checking my blood pressure and adjusting my intravenous line. The cold reality of my situation was crashing down on me. I was a widow. I was entirely alone. And I was about to be put under general anesthesia with absolutely no one to take care of my babies. I needed help. I needed my family. I reached for my cellular phone, my fingers shaking so badly I could barely unlock the screen, and I dialed the only people I thought I could count on in a life or death situation. The telephone rang 4 times before the video call finally connected. The screen illuminated, showing the luxurious living room of my parents' house. My mother appeared on the screen. She was wearing a shimmering, expensive silver evening gown, and she was in the middle of fastening a heavy pearl necklace around her neck. The background was filled with the sounds of upbeat music and the clinking of wine glasses. I could see my younger sister, Darlene, adjusting her makeup in the hallway mirror behind my mother. My name is Roxanne, and for as long as I can possibly remember, I have been the complete afterthought in my own family. Darlene was always the golden child who could do absolutely no wrong in my parents' eyes. But I pushed all of those bitter childhood memories aside because I was desperate. I looked at my mother through the digital screen and told her I was in the hospital. I told her the doctors found internal bleeding and I was being prepped for emergency surgery right at this very minute. I begged her to drive down to the hospital and pick up Vernon and Maxine. I told her I had absolutely no one else to call and that I was terrified. My mother stopped adjusting her necklace. The smile completely vanished from her heavily powdered face. She let out a long, theatrical sigh, the kind of sigh a person makes when a telemarketer interrupts their dinner. She looked off to the side and called for my father. My father leaned into the frame. He was wearing a freshly pressed tuxedo. I repeated my desperate plea to him, tears finally breaking free and rolling down my hot cheeks. I told him the doctor said I might die if I did not go into the operating room immediately. My father's expression did not soften even a fraction of an inch. Instead, his face tightened with sheer annoyance. He looked right at me through the camera lens and delivered a response that cut far deeper than any surgical scalpel ever could. He told me that I was becoming a real nuisance and a burden. He stated very clearly that they were retired now and they deserved to enjoy their lives without dealing with my constant problems. He aggressively reminded me that they had purchased premium tickets to see Elton John in concert with Darlene months ago. He said they were about to leave for a luxurious Christmas Eve dinner before the show. I sat there, completely paralyzed by the utter lack of humanity coming from my own flesh and blood. I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. My mother leaned back into the frame, glaring at me. She yelled that I should never ask them to cancel their plans again, and then she abruptly reached forward and ended the video call. The screen went totally black. The silence in my hospital room was deafening, broken only by the steady, rhythmic beeping of my heart monitor. I let my arm drop heavily onto the thin, scratchy hospital blanket. The tears came faster now, silent and bitter. I stared up at the horrible, bright fluorescent ceiling lights, feeling a crushing weight pressing down on my chest. It was not just the physical pain of the internal bleeding, it was the massive, suffocating weight of betrayal. My mind instantly drifted back over the last 3 years. I thought about the sheer amount of blood, sweat, and tears I had poured into supporting my parents. 3 years ago, they proudly announced they were taking an early retirement. They claimed they wanted to travel the world and enjoy the fruits of their labor. The only problem was that their savings were nowhere near enough to support their lavish lifestyle choices. So, out of a deeply ingrained, foolish sense of duty and love, I stepped up. Every single month, without fail, I transferred $3,200 directly into their checking account to help cover their massive mortgage and their luxury expenses. I worked late into the night. I took on extra freelance projects. I compromised my own lifestyle to ensure they never missed a payment on their expensive vehicles or their vacation club memberships. Even after my world completely shattered 6 months ago, I kept sending the money. My wonderful husband, Gordon, was driving home from work when a drunk driver ran a red light and hit his car. Gordon was my absolute rock. He had just received a wonderful promotion at his engineering firm, and we were finally feeling secure about our future. When he died, I was left entirely alone to raise 2 babies. I remember standing in the pouring rain at Gordon's funeral. I felt like a hollow shell of a human being. My parents attended the funeral, but they spent the entire reception complaining loudly about the quality of the catering and how the rain was ruining my mother's expensive shoes. Despite my monumental loss, I continued supporting them financially. I actually increased the monthly amount to $3,200 when my mother complained about struggling with inflation. I wanted to be the bigger person. I wanted to prove that family stands together during difficult times. I was managing everything on my modest salary as a graphic designer, stretching every single dollar. Unlike a friend of mine who went through a messy divorce and received a large settlement, I had no massive inheritance to fall back on. Gordon's life insurance covered the immediate debts, but that was it. And now, here I was. Bleeding internally. Facing death. And the people whose luxurious lives I funded every single month could not be bothered to miss one single concert to make sure my children were safe. The irony was absolutely crushing me. As the silent tears continued to soak into the rough fabric of my hospital pillow, Francine, the nurse, stepped closer to my bed. She had been standing quietly by the door, pretending to chart my vital signs, but I knew she had heard every single word of that horrible video call. Francine did not offer empty platitudes. She did not tell me that my parents probably just did not understand the severity of the situation. Instead, she gently placed her warm hand on my trembling shoulder and gave it a reassuring squeeze. She leaned down and spoke in a soft, steady voice. She told me that her very good friend, a woman named Nadine, was a professional nanny. Francine explained that Nadine specifically specialized in working with children who were going through traumatic experiences. She had spent years working with trauma victims at the State Children's Hospital before transitioning to become a private nanny. Francine offered to step out into the hallway and call Nadine right then and there to come sit with Vernon and Maxine. Her pure kindness, offered so freely by a complete stranger, was such a jarring, stark contrast to my own parents' callousness. I looked over at the twins. They were far too young to comprehend the gravity of what was happening. They had already lost their father to a terrible accident just 6 months ago. Now, they might lose their mother too. The thought of leaving them orphaned completely terrified me. But suddenly, I realized that leaving them in the care of people who actively viewed them as heavy burdens would be an even worse tragedy. A wave of panic washed over me as I thought about the financial aspect. I looked up at Francine, worry creeping into my voice, and asked her how much this professional nanny was going to cost. The medical bills from this emergency visit were already going to be astronomical. Gordon's insurance coverage had strict limitations, and the out-of-pocket costs were going to pile up quickly. Francine waved her hand dismissively and told me not to worry about the money right now. She said our only focus needed to be getting me prepped and ready for the operating room so I could survive this. But as a mother, I could not just stop worrying. My mind raced. Then, a sudden, powerful realization hit me. I thought about the $3,200 I was scheduled to transfer to my parents' bank account next Tuesday. That was my money. I earned it with my own salary. That money could now be used to pay for Nadine. It could be used to buy groceries for my children. That single thought sparked something deep inside my chest. It was a bright, hot flame of self-preservation that my parents had forcefully extinguished decades ago. I looked at Francine, my vision clearing as the tears finally stopped falling. I nodded my head firmly. I told her yes, please call her. I told Francine that I needed Nadine here as soon as possible. Less than 45 minutes later, a gentle knock sounded at the hospital room door. A woman with warm, kind eyes and a calm demeanor walked into the room. It was Nadine. She was exactly everything that Francine had promised she would be. She was incredibly professional, deeply kind, and she immediately knew exactly how to approach the twins. Within 5 minutes of her arrival, she was sitting on the floor with Vernon and Maxine, showing them how to build a tall tower with their blocks, completely distracting them from the frightening hospital environment. A team of surgical staff entered the room shortly after. They began bustling around my bed, checking my intravenous lines, reviewing my charts, and preparing to wheel me down to the operating theater. My heart was pounding frantically against my ribs, but my mind had never felt more crystal clear in my entire life. I looked at Francine, who was adjusting the blanket over my legs. I asked her if she could please bring me my cellular phone one more time. She retrieved it from the bedside table and placed it into my shaking hands. I opened my banking application. I navigated directly to the recurring payments section. I located the monthly transfer labeled for my parents. Without a single ounce of hesitation, I pressed the button to cancel all future automatic transfers to their account. The screen flashed a confirmation message. It was done. Next, I opened my text messages. I started a new message addressed to both my mother and my father. I did not use capital letters. I did not use exclamation points. I kept it completely factual and brutally cold. I typed that I would no longer be providing any financial support to them whatsoever. I wrote that my children and I deserve far better than constantly being treated as their afterthoughts. I ended the message with one final, definitive sentence. I told them not to contact me again. I pressed send. I watched the little notification confirm that the message had been delivered. I locked the screen, handed the phone back to Francine, and laid my head back against the pillow. As the hospital orderlies unlocked the wheels of my bed and began pushing me out into the brightly lit corridor toward the operating room, I looked back at my children. They were safe. Through the blinding physical pain and the sheer terror of facing potential death, I felt something entirely unexpected wash over my soul. I felt absolute, undeniable freedom. The double doors of the operating theater swung open, revealing a room that was blindingly bright and freezing cold. The surgical team moved with urgent precision. They transferred me from the transport bed onto the narrow operating table. A nurse placed a warm blanket over my chest, but I was still shivering uncontrollably. The anesthesiologist leaned over me. He had a kind face hidden behind a blue surgical mask. He told me he was going to administer the medication and asked me to count backward from 10. I looked up at the massive, circular surgical lights above my head. I thought about Gordon. I thought about his warm smile and the way he used to hold Maxine until she fell asleep. I silently promised him that I would fight to stay alive for our babies. I got to the number 7, and then the world went completely black. The surgery was successful, but the internal damage had been far more extensive than the initial scans had shown. Fixing the bleeding took hours, and the procedure left my body significantly weaker than anyone had anticipated. I spent the next 5 days in the intensive care unit and then a standard recovery room. For the first 48 hours, I was essentially trapped in a heavy, drug-induced fog. I drifted in and out of consciousness. I would wake up to the rhythmic hissing of the oxygen machine, feel a sharp, burning agony radiating from the long incision on my abdomen, and then slip back into the darkness. Through it all, I was endlessly, profoundly grateful for Nadine. She went completely above and beyond any standard professional obligation. During the days, when visiting hours were open, she brought Vernon and Maxine into my hospital room. She would lift them up so they could gently pat my hand, ensuring they knew their mother was still there. Then, when evening came, she would pack up their toys and take them back to my apartment so they could sleep safely in their own familiar beds. It was during the afternoon of my 3rd day in the hospital that the fog in my brain finally began to clear. The heavy painkillers were being reduced, and I was becoming much more lucid. I managed to reach over to the small plastic tray table next to my bed and grab my cellular phone. I pressed the power button, and the screen lit up. What I saw made my stomach twist into a tight, cold knot. The screen of my telephone was completely covered in notifications. A small red circle indicated that I had 27 missed calls. There were also numerous text messages rapidly filling up my screen. They were all from my parents and my sister Darlene. I adjusted the controls on my hospital bed to raise myself into a slightly more upright position. I winced as the stitches pulled tightly against my skin. I took a deep, steadying breath and began reading through the barrage of messages. The texts from my parents followed a very predictable, highly manipulative pattern. The earliest messages, sent right after I canceled the bank transfer, were filled with confusion. My mother texted to ask if my bank account had been hacked because their scheduled payment had not arrived. When I did not reply, the confusion quickly morphed into venomous anger. My father sent a long paragraph demanding to know what kind of childish tantrum I was throwing. He accused me of being completely ungrateful and trying to ruin their holiday season. Then came the desperate pleas. My mother texted again, completely ignoring the fact that I had just undergone major surgery. She started complaining loudly about their mortgage payment. She whined that they had bills due and that they relied on my contribution to maintain their standard of living. I scrolled through message after message. I read every single word they wrote over the span of 3 days. Not once. Not one single time did either of them ask how my emergency surgery went. They never asked if I was in pain. They never asked if I was even alive. They never asked who was taking care of the twins. The absolute final message from my father was particularly telling, highlighting the sheer depth of their delusion and selfishness. He wrote that I could not just cut them off like this without warning. He then proceeded to inform me that they had planned a luxury cruise for the following month. He complained bitterly that the tickets were entirely non-refundable and that they needed my money to pay off the credit card balance for the trip. I just stared at the glowing screen. I did not cry this time. The tears were completely gone. All that remained was a cold, hard realization that these people were incapable of loving me. I closed their message thread and opened the texts from my sister, Darlene. Darlene's messages were drastically different in tone from our parents' selfish demands. She seemed genuinely confused and highly frantic. Her first message stated that Mom and Dad had just told her I was having some minor, routine procedure done at the clinic. Her next message asked what was going on and demanded to know why our parents were suddenly freaking out and screaming about money and bank accounts. I read her words carefully. The puzzle pieces rapidly snapped into place in my mind. It dawned on me that my parents had completely lied to Darlene about the severity of my medical situation. They deliberately downplayed a life-threatening emergency into a minor procedure just so they could justify their horrific choice to go to an Elton John concert over helping me with my children. They knew Darlene would judge them if she knew the truth, so they fed her a convenient lie to protect their own image. I decided right then and there to tell Darlene the absolute truth. My fingers felt thick and clumsy due to the lingering effects of the intravenous medication, but I slowly typed out the full, unvarnished story. I told her about collapsing on the living room floor. I told her about the diagnosis of severe internal bleeding. I told her about the doctors telling me I needed immediate surgery. I typed out exactly what our father had said to me on the video call. I told her that he called me a nuisance and a burden. I explained that I had to hire a stranger to watch my babies while I went under the knife. I hit send. Her response came back within 2 minutes. Darlene was absolutely horrified. She texted back, typing out, "Oh my God, Roxanne." She swore to me that she had absolutely no idea it was an emergency surgery. She explained that our parents had explicitly told her I was just being overly dramatic about a routine checkup. She promised me that she would have rushed straight to the hospital to watch the twins if she had known the truth. She apologized profusely and said she was so incredibly sorry. I sat back against my pillows and let out a long breath. I believed her. Darlene was never a truly cruel person at heart. She had just been raised in a highly toxic environment where she was constantly taught by our parents that her needs and her comfort always came first. Our parents had groomed her to be selfish, but she still possessed empathy. Perhaps this shocking revelation would finally shatter the illusion and help her see our parents for who they truly were. By the time the doctors finally signed my discharge papers, I had spent 5 long days lying in that hospital bed. I used that time to do a lot of thinking. I formulated a very clear, highly actionable plan to protect myself and my children moving forward. I had made several major decisions. First, I had a long conversation with Nadine. I officially hired her to work part-time to help me with Vernon and Maxine during my recovery. Her presence brought an immense sense of stability to our home. Second, the very morning I returned to my apartment, I sat at my kitchen table and contacted a reputable family lawyer. I explained my situation and instructed him to draft a comprehensive, legally binding will. I explicitly designated my trusted best friend, Sylvia, as the legal guardian of the twins should anything ever happen to me. I made absolutely certain the lawyer included ironclad clauses stating that my parents were never, under any circumstances, to be granted custody of my children. I was not dealing with a complicated divorce, Gordon was gone, and I had sole legal authority. I was going to use it to build a fortress around my kids. Third, I went into the settings of my cellular phone and permanently blocked both of my parents' telephone numbers. I decided to allow Darlene limited contact. I wanted to give her a chance, but I needed to carefully assess her sincerity and ensure she was not acting as a spy for our parents. The financial implications of my decision to cut ties were truly significant. That $3,200 monthly payment I had been sending to my parents represented nearly a third of my total income as a graphic designer. Without that massive, suffocating financial burden dragging me down, everything changed. I realized I could actually afford proper, high-quality childcare. I could start putting substantial amounts into a college fund for the twins. I could finally start rebuilding the critical emergency savings fund that had been completely depleted, paying for Gordon's funeral and immediate expenses after his death. That first night back in my own apartment, I lay in my own bed. The twins were sleeping soundly in their room directly across the hall. I felt a very complex mix of intense emotions. There was certainly guilt. It was a deeply ingrained, conditioned feeling that I was somehow doing something wrong by putting myself and my children first. My parents had installed those emotional buttons in me decades ago. There was also a significant amount of fear about managing my physical recovery while caring for two highly energetic toddlers. But beneath the guilt and beneath the fear, there was an entirely unfamiliar sense of deep self-respect taking root inside my chest. I was finally standing up and taking control. Exactly 2 weeks after my emergency surgery, I was very slowly starting to regain a fraction of my physical strength. The long incision site on my abdomen still throbbed with a dull, constant ache, and it flared into sharp pain whenever I moved too quickly or bent down to pick up a toy. But I was managing noticeably better with each passing day. Nadine had truly been a godsend. She arrived promptly each morning to help feed and entertain the twins while I sat at my computer and worked from home. My graphic design clients had been surprisingly understanding about my limited availability, and I was deeply grateful that my salary was not tied to a strict office schedule. This remote work arrangement allowed me to stay close to my children while my body healed. During those 2 weeks, Darlene had visited my apartment twice. She brought over large containers of healthy, home-cooked meals. She spent hours sitting on the floor playing with Vernon and Maxine. Our conversations were very cautious at first, carefully avoiding explosive topics. But eventually, she began to open up about her own experiences growing up with our parents. One evening, while we watched the twins play, she admitted something that shocked me. She said our parents had always made it seem like I was the one actively choosing to distance myself from the family. She confessed she never realized they were the ones constantly pushing me away and belittling me. I was beginning to see an entirely new side to my sister, a side that had been hidden beneath years of parental manipulation. While I was not ready to trust her completely, I truly appreciated her effort. Then, the fragile peace I had built was suddenly shattered. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon. The heavy knock at the front door echoed through the apartment. It was a loud, demanding knock. I had been half expecting it for 2 weeks. I stood up slowly, clutching my side. I walked over to the door and looked through the small glass peephole. There they were. My parents were standing together in the hallway. My mother was nervously clutching her expensive designer leather purse against her chest. My father stood right beside her, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, with that familiar, deep-etched impatience visible on his face. My heart started pounding wildly. I hesitated for a moment, taking a deep breath to steady my nerves. Then, I undid the deadbolt, leaving the heavy security chain in place, and opened the door just enough to speak through the narrow gap. I looked at them coldly and asked exactly what they wanted. I was surprised to hear my own voice sound so incredibly steady. My mother immediately launched into her rehearsed performance. She used a sugary, fake sweet tone that instantly raised every single defense mechanism I possessed. She called me darling and claimed they had been so terribly worried about me. She complained that I had not been answering their calls and said they needed to make sure I and the twins were all right. I stared right through her fake concern. I replied flatly that we were fine. I told her that if that was all they needed, they could leave. But my father immediately dropped the act. He pushed his large hand slightly against the wooden door, making the security chain pull tight. He interrupted my mother, his voice harsh. He declared that it was absolutely not all. He demanded that we discuss this ridiculous financial situation right now. He complained loudly that the bank had called them about their missed mortgage payment, and he whined that they actually had to dip into their cruise savings account just to cover the bill.